The 2025 Australian Grand Prix was another example of just when you think you have all the answers based off pre-season testing and speculation, a living, breathing race with a little bit of rain will throw most of it out of the window. We saw some fantastic drives up front from Lando Norris and Max Verstappen, followed by a series of uneventful to disastrous displays. Drivers who we were really kind of expecting more from were having appalling races, and those who we had more or less written off actually did quite an impressive job. But wet race aside, the closeness of the grid this year is incredible. It looks like it's going to be a season where the driver ability is going to make all the difference. So I'm glad to say F1 is back and I am loving it. But ladies and gentlemen, every facet of this race contained things which I've put into categories called the good, bad, and ugly, and I've taken the liberty of doing this for you. All that was good, all that was bad, and all that was downright ugly about the 2025 Australian Grand Prix. So make yourself comfortable, pour yourself a drink, and let's crack on. Okay, so if we're kicking things off looking at the good, it would be very poor form to do it in any other way than looking at Lando Norris. After starting from pole, commanding the Grand Prix, and not letting the pressure from Oscar or Max get to him, we could actually be looking at a Lando Norris who is tougher, stronger, more resilient, and who, might I add, seems to be bloody quick as well. There were moments where Oscar and Max were gaining up behind him with DRS and everything, and he was looking unfazed. He was chilled. He was able to handle the situation. Now, there were a couple of hairy moments. One, of course, was when himself and Piastri both left the circuit and rejoined, but a cooler head prevailed, as well as a much more mature-looking strategic aspect within the McLaren team, where regular wins is now going to be their business. And if I might add, it looks like their business is going to be good. There was, of course, this brief hold position order from the McLaren pit wall to Oscar, which was surprising, but also, no doubt, gave Lando that little bit of advantage, which I'm sure will be discussed about in the week ahead. But for now, with cars flying off everywhere, you could argue McLaren did what they had to do. And I know we're only one race into the season, and not to get ahead of ourselves, but I think we are looking at a slightly different Lando Norris to last year, where he's showing traits of development and growth, and how he can be better than the shy guy that we saw last year. And if he can continue this form into China, well, I think we're going to see another example of a driver who is getting closer to being the finished article. Now, from what I saw at Max's display at Melbourne, the best way I can kind of summarise this drive is that this is a guy who hasn't read the 2025 post-Adrian Newey script at Red Bull. Most, of course, were predicting a drop-off in performance and for Red Bull to be overtaken by the likes of Ferrari and Mercedes, etc. Now, the car might be one thing, but from what we saw in the race with the changeable conditions and Max's adaptability, he did make the case that he is still the most complete driver on the grid at the moment. Now, shoot me down if you like, but to stay close to the McLarens when they both seem to have the far superior car is an enormous achievement, and just shows that for Red Bull especially, the driver is going to make all the difference this year. Now, in comparison to Lawson's display, it looks like the RB21 needs someone who can comfortably operate the car at 120%, especially if they're going to stay up the sharp end of the grid this year. And so the takeaway from this, I think, is Max is now the most important factor within the Red Bull team. Because even if the RB21 isn't the fastest car on paper, even if it's second, third, or fourth fastest, he has that ability to haul it up the grid into places it has no business being, and especially in wet weather conditions, pull off results like he did on Sunday. And now, my third choice for the good is not George, it's not Kimi, it's actually Mercedes on the whole. And the whole reason they did well was because in a massively eventful race, both drivers had a very uneventful race, apart from one or two minor moments, drawing barely any attention to themselves at all. Now, whilst George Russell had stealth mode fully activated, barely appearing on any of the TV coverage that we saw of the race, Kimi had a slightly more action-packed race, but overall, both of them, the head down, keep going mentality, just paid off. George, of course, drove to a very familiar looking third place now, a credit to his actual ability and everything, PR persona aside, which is a bit love-hate. And it was a fantastic debut, of course, for Kimi Antonelli, coming home a brilliant fourth place. And also an indication that he might be that driver that Toto has been hoping for all along. Kimi gained an astonishing 11 places in that Grand Prix, more than anyone else, and also didn't let any brief little shortcomings or setbacks get to him. So So it was an incredible showing in the wet weather where far more experienced drivers couldn't hack it, and there was Antonelli showing ability well beyond his years. And also, he was the only rookie that didn't crash, so fair play to him. So is he a worthy replacement for Hamilton? On track? Maybe so, especially when you consider where his fellow rookies and also his predecessor finished in the Grand Prix. So well done Mercedes, well done George and Kimi, Russinelli, Mercedes, moving forwards. Now, although Lando Norris was voted driver of the day, what we saw from Alex Albon in that Grand Prix, holding it together, staying cool, fighting off charges from faster cars behind him, he made a solid case for being voted driver of the day, and in my opinion, should have got it. Now, considering where Williams were in 2024, Albon has now already scored over half of the team's total points tally from last season. A great statement of intent for both driver and team moving forward. And after all the hullabaloo about Sainz joining, it was a fantastic way, I think, for Albon to grab the media by the scruff of the neck and say, look, I effing told you so. Everyone was expecting Sainz to come in and show Albon up, but look who delivered and did the business. He crossed the line 5th, but then was promoted to 4th due to Antonelli's disqualification, but then was later reversed. 5th place is nothing to be sniffed at all. Now, although we're only one race in, this is a clear sign, I think, that Albon this year is not going to be a pushover, and I'm really excited to see what he can deliver in China. Even if it is wet or dry conditions, it'll be great to see what he can put up there. And in fact, he's actually done Williams a massive favour, because when you consider the state of Haas right now, Albon might have guaranteed Williams at least 9th place in the constructors' standings. So literally speaking, for Albon, Williams and everyone involved, mathematically now, it cannot get any worse than 2024. The only way now for Williams is up. Now for this next one, the impossible happened, and Lance Stroll had an amazing race. Now, I think exactly for the same reason George Russell got a great result, Lance just stayed out of trouble and just let all the cars around him make the mistakes, including, might I add, his vastly more experienced and qualified colleague, Fernando Alonso. Now, overall, I don't really know how this has sort of happened. Sometimes the universe does things that we don't really quite understand. His showings in the wet weather have never really been that amazing, but from what we saw in Melbourne, he disappeared at the green light on lap 1 and then reappeared at the checkered flag. That seemed to be his race. Now, either Lawrence has invested in time travel and has bent reality, or Lance has potentially harnessed what he's actually capable of if he is properly motivated and hungry enough. And also when he's interested. So, full credit to Lance, and let's see what he can do in China so that he can prove that he is not just a one-trick pony or donkey. You know what I mean? Okay, swiftly moving on. Now, how can I mention the good of the Australian Grand Prix without mentioning the guy who was giving all of us over 35 years of age hope, Nico Hülkenberg. And once again, he had an uneventful drive. Taking advantage from when other cars had problems, Hulk used his experience and cool head to slide neatly into the points. And by the way, already outscoring what the entire Sauber team could muster for the entire 2024 season. And so, if anyone at Sauber needed to justify why they signed Nico Hülkenberg, I guess that was it. And it just again shows that in these sorts of conditions, you could have a car that is bottom tier to mid tier at best, put it in the hands of a proper, experienced driver, and these are the results you can get. Now, I know it's a wet race, we haven't had a dry one yet, and it was full of retirements and everything, but I am intrigued to see what we can see from Hulk in his new lean green Sauber machine. There. Right, so that wraps up the good, and now it's time to look at the bad. Now, so I'm kicking things off in a very painful fashion with the local hero, Oscar Piastri, and please, bear with me. Now, for 99% of the race, he drove phenomenally well. He kept Lando Norris honest for most of the race and did a phenomenal job at keeping Max Verstappen at bay as well. Now, you're probably wondering why I've plonked Oscar Piastri into the bad category, and it is simply just for the series of events that led to him beaching the car and almost retiring from the race. And is it harsh to put him in this category? Probably yes, but Oscar will, I'm sure, admit this wrecked his race and cost himself a chance of even a win towards the end. Because as both McLarens went off on the same corner to different degrees, had Piastri held it together, surely he could have overtaken Lando Norris for the win. So he's not in the bad category for the overall race. It's more that the incident which cost him massively. And I think as well, moving forward, if he's going to get the edge over Lando Norris, he has got to get hold of these pole positions. He's got to start racking them up now, because all of these things meant that he was denied a win at his home Grand Prix, and also that the Melbourne fans were denied once again an Australian on the podium. But I'm sure he can pull back from this, and his recovery drive to scrape back those 2 points was actually pretty amazing. He didn't give up, he managed somehow to get his car unbeached and back onto the track. What a show there. And it's those 2 points that he scraped back could make all the difference towards the end of the year. But I think in all honesty, it did show that Oscar is still behind Lando at this point, probably much more than we expected. So if he's going to beat Lando, especially when he's firing on all cylinders, Oscar is really going to have to turn things up a notch moving forwards. And so now that we're getting into the meat and veg of the bad category, my next choice are most of the rookies and new drivers. More specifically, I mean Doohan, Hajar, Bortoleto, Behrman, and especially Lawson. I know it's only one race and everything, but I think there's a massive case of overconfidence exceeding actual ability. Especially when, as a rookie, the objective surely is just bring the car home. Just bring it back to the garage in one piece. And so now, just to get through these, Hajar really couldn't have had a worse possible start to his F1 career. In a team where drivers get a bullet in the head before they know it, he's got to make a seriously good impression in China when he makes his actual F1 debut. But I will say though, in his post-race interview, it was actually quite refreshing to see him displaying actual emotion, which F1 drivers now tend not really to do. You really felt that he was disappointed and also mortified by what happened. You know, rather than getting the filtered, twitchy PR robot response that we normally get. But then moving on to the driver who had the second worst start to his career, Jack Doohan. And I'm sorry to say, with all this pressure to perform, I wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't turn in a good result in China. That is going to be curtains for his career. I hate to say this, but we know what Flavio can be like. I know that he apparently has 5 or 6 races to show what he can do, but if he doesn't score points in China, then I really think that we're going to see the great Briatore switcheroo. But then again, there's no real guarantee that Colapinto would do any better in the wet. We don't really have a great idea of him yet, so what do you do? So overall, a solid result is needed for Doohan just to save his F1 career pretty much before it's even started. Bortoleto had a fairly decent race holding it together before making that mistake and crashing out, in contrast to his much more experienced Hulkenberg, who I'm sure he can learn a lot from moving forward. But can the Sauber actually score points in the dry weather later in the season? Probably highly unlikely. Ollie Behrman, of course, did nothing and couldn't really do anything in a Haas which seems to have rejoined its natural habitat at the back of the grid. And Liam Lawson, I sense, he showed us, not just in the race but also in qualifying, that if Red Bull don't have Max Verstappen in their lineup, they are screwed. Completely and utterly screwed. And if this race serves Liam Lawson anything, it is surely a Drive to Survive episode about him. So aside from Kimi Antonelli, the general message for the rookies and newbies is must do better. And so next up in the bad category, I'm going to serve you a Spanish omelette of disappointment, and I am of course talking about Fernando Alonso and Carlos Sainz. Now first off, Carlos Sainz going off so early on was disastrous for Williams, especially considering what Albon was able to do. And strangely, the incident seems to have been brushed under the carpet. However, if Lance Stroll, for example, had gone off in the same manner, the memes would be flying around all over the place. And so by costing Williams an even better start to the season and also giving them a very good position in the 2025 World Destructors Championship, this surely isn't what James Fowles had planned when he invited Carlos Sainz into his hotel room. But in fairness, it did look like the smooth operator hung around in the Williams garage afterwards speaking with the engineers, rather than just sodding off into his trailer. So was this a terrible start for Carlos Sainz? Absolutely. Was it a blip? I'd say absolutely as well. Now I have to say, when I saw that Aston Martin slamming into the barriers, my first thoughts were, here we go again. Good old Lance Stroll up to his old tricks, keeping the safety car drivers employed. But no, of course, it was the guy who's made 405 F1 starts, Fernando Alonso. Now for Alonso and Aston, it's going to be interesting to see how things pan out for the rest of the season, especially in the dry races, but I'm still left wondering with Alonso, especially at the end of last season, what's his end game here? What's still in this for him? What's he kind of working towards? Because it's rare, seriously rare, that he makes mistakes like this. So it's going to be Really interesting to see what he can pull out of the bag in China and Bahrain as well. Because after this new resurgence from Williams and also perhaps Alpine as well, Aston Martin are going to need their front man on his game. And so now we're getting into the ugly section where it's going to get seriously down and seriously dirty. So let's get things started with a team where, if you believed all their preseason marketing and messages and advertising and everything, you would think that they had all their questions answered. And that is Ferrari, which also includes Hamilton and Leclerc. Now for Leclerc, he's been around the block, it's business as usual for him. If his seat during the race is filling up with water, so what? This is just a Ferrari thing. For him now, it's just a case of accepting that he's going to be disappointed. It's just a case of how much and how often. Now, I'm sure Leclerc will be able to win a few races this year, but given the way that their rivals have kicked off the season in good form, this is absolutely not the way they wanted to start. Now, I'm really keen to hear your thoughts on this, but did anyone else think that Hamilton was getting seriously annoyed and irritated about the excessive radio communications from the Ferrari pit wall, with Lewis interrupting the communications with just the message of "let me race, leave me alone"? Now, of course, this could be a sign that both parties are still figuring out what makes each other tick and how both prefer to work. And I think that's fair enough. At a team like Mercedes, for example, that's fine. However, at Ferrari, there's the Ferrari way, and there's the other way, which is the exit. So it's going to be intriguing to see how this develops moving forward, and it's fascinating that this kind of thing hadn't been realised yet. They haven't found a way of how to communicate with each other properly during races. The information that Hamilton wants to hear, but also the info that the pit wall want to deliver. There isn't a way of meshing these two together just yet. And it's also clear that he's really missing Bono already and his style of managing his driver whilst he's out there on track. So anyway, not the start that Ferrari wanted at all, especially when the objective would have been a podium for either of them or both of them. And actually they failed quite catastrophically, with even a Sauber with a Ferrari engine in the back of it finishing ahead of them. And with everything going on as well, Ferrari still don't seem strategically on par with the likes of McLaren, Red Bull, or Mercedes, which does make me wonder, despite all the change going on at Maranello, will it still be business as usual for them? Well, let's keep our eyes peeled in China. Okay, so next up in the ugly category is Red Bull. And aside from Max and his podium and everything, which is fantastic, when you look at Liam Lawson's side of the garage, I think are going to have serious problems ahead for the 2025 season. Because firstly, I think it's confirmation that Lawson can't make a blind bit of difference in Perez's old seat, whether it's wet or dry. And also it's that if Red Bull did lose Max to another team, what the hell are they going to do? Because you've got to wonder, had they lost Max for 2025 and had to field a lineup of Perez and Tsunoda or Ricciardo or Lawson or any combination of the four of them, would that be a miracle cure, or would the team just be absolutely cooked? And as I said earlier, Max can quite happily operate the car at 120%, driving the car into positions that it possibly has no business being in. But from his display at Melbourne, Liam Lawson is nowhere near that. He can barely operate the car at 80%, for example. I mean, going out in Q1 was shocking, but the race was just a disaster. Especially as his share price has been floating quite high since he made his debut at AlphaTauri. And with this sort of revelation, my thinking is that Red Bull now have to do anything at all costs to keep Max on board for the future. Just get him to name his price. A small island somewhere, shares in Red Bull Energy, just name your price. And especially knowing what Helmut Marko and Christian Horner can be like, Lawson really has to turn this around now, because they've taken a huge gamble by taking him on rather than Yuki Tsunoda. So anyway, controversial one of course, but let me know your thoughts in the comments. And so my next choice for the ugly category is Alpine and RB, and I'm doing both of these teams at the same time because they appeared to have identical races. Both teams had one of their rookie drivers crash very early on. In this case, it was Doohan and Hajar, and both had another driver sitting very happily in the points, very comfortable, until the mix-up at the end cost them their position, which led to both teams finishing with 0 points. Massively disappointing for both of them, who seem to have a car which can quite happily qualify and race in the top 10. Now I sense that RB will quite happily go towards China, knowing that they can turn this around and flip it around, but Alpine, slightly different story. I think they now know that if they go to China and don't pull in a good result, then skulls are going to be crushed. Jack Doohan is of course on the chopping block, but knowing where Alpine are right now versus where they want to get to, Pierre Gasly may not be that safe either. So heading over to China and Bahrain afterwards, points is a must for both teams. And saving the worst till last, I give you Haas, who despite the changing conditions and circumstances, rain, safety cars, yellow flags, strategy opportunities, were unable to deliver anything. This team did absolutely nothing and were rooted to the bottom of the standings for the whole race pretty much. And I just find it mind-boggling, given the variables that were going on in the race, all the chaos. Neither the drivers or strategists were able to come up with anything. What the actual hell happened to my beloved Haas team from last season? Where have they gone? And not only is this disastrous for them considering how Sauber and Williams seem to have made massive leaps forward, but the gulf between Haas and anyone right now seems to be vast. And to be honest, I really did expect more from Ocon and Behrman, given what we know that both are capable of. But if the car is just a shed, then what are you going to do? And yes, of course, we know it's only one race in, but from what we've seen, I think for Haas, it is going to be a very long season ahead, and a difficult one, I might add as well. But overall, though, as a spectacle, as an actual race, it was an awesome way to kick off the season. And I can't wait to see how the cars line up on a dry track as well. That's going to be massively exciting to see, and considering how the grid is so packed closely together. The times between first and last are smaller than ever, so the drivers are going to make all the difference, which might also open up a debate as to what's best for a team, a wise, experienced old head or a young, hungry rookie. So anyway, let's wait and see what China delivers. Thank you so much for watching. Please be sure to like, share and subscribe. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you soon. Cheers.